Picture a young boy left alone in a vast desert, with no food, no water, and close to dying. His mother cries quietly and moves away, unable to watch her child fade. The boy has no path forward, no legacy to hold on to. His family cast him out, his father forgot him, and the promise once made to him vanished until the skies responded. A voice shattered the silence. God listened to the boy's cry. This scene, often missed in biblical passages, holds one of the most powerful and puzzling moments of redemption in all Scripture. How did a cast-out child become the ancestor of rulers? Why do prophets speak his name long after his time? What does Ishmael mean for those who today feel left behind and unseen? This isn't just a tale of someone who lived through hardship. It's the image of all who have been dismissed, yet still reached by God's mercy. A long-hidden mystery surrounds Ishmael's journey, one that stretches across history and still stirs in the eastern winds. You're about to understand why Ishmael was never merely a side character in the Bible. Stay with us as we reveal the hidden truth about Ishmael, the forsaken son who heard God's voice. Walk with us through Ishmael's transformation into a figure of strength, belief, and destiny, even though so many turned away from him. A dry land between Canaan and Egypt. The sun burns over the sand. A lone woman walks forward. She is expecting a child, weak, short of breath. The stillness around her is overwhelming, but someone is listening. His name would be Ishmael, and even before he entered the world or opened his eyes, he had already been chosen by God. Abraham did not pick the name, and neither did Hagar. It was given from above, a name full of meaning and burden. Ishmael means God listens. It wasn't a name picked out of affection, but a reply to a desperate plea. Still, Ishmael's birth would not end the hardship. It was just the start. Ishmael was born to Abraham and Hagar, an Egyptian maid. Hagar wasn't loved. She was used out of despair. Sarah, Abraham's true wife, could not have children. In a human effort to speed up a divine plan, she offered Hagar to her husband. That's how Hagar conceived, but what seemed like a solution became a deep wound. From that moment, a child began to grow, and so did jealousy. Carrying a child, Hagar ran away. The stress was too much. Sarah's words cut deep, and her presence was too heavy to bear. In the wilderness, Hagar collapsed. She had no strength, no water, no place to go. At that moment of total weakness, a messenger from God appeared. He saw her, heard her, and spoke words that changed her story. "You are carrying a son," the angel said. "You will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your suffering." Genesis 16:11. She had been running from her pain, yet found herself in the gaze of the divine. But that wasn't the end of the message. The angel described the child's future. He will be like a wild donkey, free, fierce, and untamed. He will stand against many, and many will stand against him. Genesis 16:12. His spirit would be wild, made for struggle. He wasn't meant for soft beds or gentle hands, but for heat, wind, and hardship. This boy would not grow up behind fabric walls, but shaped by the storms of the desert. Hagar, stunned, fell to the ground, tears blending with the sand. For the first time, someone, no, God himself, had acknowledged her sorrow. She cried out, "You are the one who sees me." Genesis 16:13. The place was later named Bir Lahai Roi, which means, "Well of the one who saw me." In that moment, the unseen became seen, and the boy's name was forever sealed. Hagar went back. She returned to the camp and to Sarah. But she wasn't the same woman. She now carried more than a child. She carried a divine promise. Time passed, and on a quiet night, Ishmael came into the world. Abraham embraced his son and gave him the name sent from heaven. He adored him. He raised him with care, but not even deep fatherly love could prevent the tensions of jealousy. Ishmael was raised among tents and flocks. He didn't learn in classrooms, but from shepherds with weathered hands. They taught him to notice tracks, to hear the wind, to honor the silence of the stars. He was not the child of royalty. He was a boy of sand and light. His soul was honest, but heavy with the burden of a broken home. Even his innocent laughter made Sarah uneasy. Years passed. Ishmael would one day have 12 sons. They would become leaders and founders of tribes. Genesis 25:13-16 lists their names: Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedemah. His wife was Egyptian, chosen by Hagar. He didn't construct cities. He pitched tents. He didn't lead armies. Still, his descendants mastered the desert trade paths. But before becoming a people, he had to endure banishment. Ishmael lived many generations before Christ. Long before Jesus was born in Bethlehem, Ishmael had already walked the dry roads linking Canaan and Egypt. He never met the Messiah, but his descendants would later encounter another prophet. What drove him? What marked his legacy? Endurance, protection, leadership. Ishmael became a father figure in a time marked by sand and struggle, a soul who endured. But even survivors carry invisible scars that years cannot erase. Between the tents, the quiet spoke louder than voices. Hagar moved with calm, careful steps. Ishmael played among the animals, laughing like any child would. But not everyone shared his joy. Sarah, Abraham's rightful wife, watched the boy with eyes filled with tension and discomfort. He was born of a servant, yet also Abraham's eldest son. Ishmael didn't understand the burden he bore. To him, life was simple. He ran across open ground, climbed hills, petted sheep, and slipped behind tent flaps as if the world were made only for games. He couldn't see why Sarah's glance sometimes made the air feel heavy, or why workers turned away as he came near. He just lived. Abraham, already well in age, held a deep love for that boy. Often he took him on long walks to check the wells or gaze at the stars. In Ishmael, he saw the promise he had waited for, finally made real. This was his child, his kin, his joy. It was Ishmael who first called him father. And still, each time he sat beside Abraham, something inside Sarah stirred. Something. She masked it with polite smiles and soft gestures. But Hagar noticed it all. Some days she stayed silent from sunrise to night. Other times she stared at her son with wet eyes, caught between anger, regret, or sadness. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the dunes, Ishmael approached Sarah with a small bunch of desert flowers he had picked himself. A sweet gesture. With small hands and a bright smile, he offered them. But instead of warmth, he was met with quiet. She glanced at the bouquet, then at him and said, "Go play with your mother." Hagar, watching from a distance, felt a deep ache, not for herself, but for her son. She knew she had given Abraham a child, yet she would never be truly part of the blessing given to him. Ishmael had a place in his father's arms, but not in the heart of the home. And day by day, living together became more delicate. A plate set down with too much force, a sharp glance during supper, praise given to the children of other maids, praise Sarah never gave to Ishmael. Small, sharp wounds, barely noticeable to outsiders, cut deeply into those already hurting. Abraham tried to keep his love steady. He cherished Sarah, the woman he had shared his dreams with all his life. But he also held deep affection for Ishmael, the child God had promised to bless. He noticed the rising strain in the household, but kept his feelings quiet. And in that silence, Ishmael ran joyfully, unaware that his laughter stirred a hidden storm. At night, Sarah often lay awake, eyes on the tent ceiling, listening to the boy's footsteps outside as he played with the animals. She would ask herself, why did he come first? Why did the servant give birth while I remained empty? She wanted peace, but inside her, something was forming. It had no name yet, but it was waiting to act. As Ishmael grew, the tension inside the home grew with him. Abraham's love, once a comfort for Sarah, became a daily reminder. The servant's son was alive, thriving, calling her husband father. Every one of Ishmael's movements pressed heavier on her heart. The years slipped by. Abraham's face aged with lines, and Sarah's hair whitened in the harsh sunlight. But her barren womb still cried out louder than words. Ishmael had left infancy behind. He was now a boy, steady on his feet and sharp in thought. He raced between tents, climbed high stones, and watched the shepherds closely. Yet his presence could not fill the space within Sarah. That laughter, cheerful as it was, didn't belong to her. It wasn't the sound of her own child. Abraham, nearing 100, still clung to the divine promise. He could never forget it. God had said his offspring would number like the stars. But over 10 years had passed since Ishmael was born, and no fresh message had come, no signs, no angels, just the wind and Sarah's quiet weeping nearby. Then suddenly, everything shifted. 3 strangers arrived in the open lands of Mamre. They came without horses or swords. Their clothes were simple, but their eyes held something unearthly. Abraham rushed out to meet them, offering his kindness as always. He asked them to rest beneath the trees. He called for bread, fresh water, milk, and meat to be brought. He gave them his best, not realizing that eternity had entered his camp. As they ate, one of them spoke. His voice stopped Sarah cold as she listened from the edge of the tent. "By this time next year I will return, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Genesis 18:10. Sarah laughed under her breath, startled and disbelieving. It wasn't a laugh of joy. It was low, almost bitter, carrying the weight of years filled with waiting, sorrow, embarrassment, and dashed hopes. "Now that I'm old and my husband too, will I really know such joy?" she whispered to herself. But the one speaking had heard her words. "Why did Sarah laugh?" he asked gently. "Is anything too difficult for the Lord? At the appointed time next year, I'll return, and Sarah will have a son." Genesis 18:13-14. Sarah denied laughing at all, but the figure, God's messenger, answered with calm certainty, "Yes, you did laugh." Genesis 18:15. Then the visitors rose and left, but their words didn't leave. They echoed in Sarah's mind like glowing embers. The days that came were silent, heavier than the fabric stretched over the tents. Abraham looked at Sarah with a soft gaze, both hopeful and uncertain. He couldn't predict what was coming, yet something within him stirred, an inner whisper that told him the promise was near. Sarah, however, resisted the thought. It was easier to stay empty than to believe again and be hurt. She was tired of holding dreams that never lived. But her body began to speak differently. What once felt like exhaustion became deep, restful sleep. Her lack of appetite gave way to cravings. And then one day, it happened. Not pain, but a stirring, movement, a sign of life. With shaking hands, she touched her belly, and deep inside, she realized it. The promise had taken root. The months that followed moved slowly, full of doubt and fragile belief. Abraham's face lit up more with each sunrise, as if the years fell off him. Then one evening, beneath a quiet sky, the time came. Sarah delivered a child. The newborn's cry broke the night air like a gentle thunder. This time, Sarah laughed with all her soul, laughter soaked in tears and overflowing with thanks. Abraham held the child close. The boy was named Isaac, meaning he laughs. Genesis 21:3-6. God has made me laugh, Sarah said, and everyone who hears will laugh with me. But not every face smiled. Hagar stood apart, watching in silence. Ishmael, now around 14, looked with interest at the tiny child. He didn't fully grasp what had changed, but something shifted inside him. A space that had always belonged to him alone was no longer his. The love once poured only on him would now be split. And more than that, the child crying inside that tent carried the name and blood of the rightful wife, the one tied to the covenant. In the days that followed, celebration filled the camp. Dishes were prepared for the feast. Animals were offered in sacrifice. Isaac grew strong, full of life. Everyone's attention shifted to him and Ishmael. He remained, but no longer in the spotlight, no longer the only son. During a feast celebrating Isaac's weaning, a big event in those days, Ishmael was seen laughing. Maybe it was teasing or just the carefree joy of youth. But Sarah noticed. That laugh was too much for her. She went to Abraham and said, "Send away this slave and her son. He will not share the inheritance with my son Isaac." Genesis 21:10. Abraham was shaken. He loved Ishmael, his firstborn. But that night God came to him in a dream. "Don't be distressed over the boy or the servant. Listen to Sarah. Your legacy will pass through Isaac. But don't worry, I will also make a great nation from the slave's son, for he too is your child." Genesis 21:12-13. And so, with sorrow in his heart, Abraham packed water and bread and sent Hagar and Ishmael away. What once had been a quiet tension now became a painful separation. Before continuing, we'd like to ask for your support. Subscribe and leave a like to help us keep sharing these meaningful Bible stories. Let's now follow Ishmael's path forward. The heat that day was brutal. The tents were decorated with bright cloth. Animals had been prepared, and the smell of roasted meat spread through the air. Servants clapped and danced. There was laughter, joy, and song. Isaac, the long-awaited child, was being weaned, a moment of pride and tradition. Abraham looked over the celebration, his expression calm but eyes full of emotion. He had waited a lifetime for this. Isaac clung to his legs, beaming with happiness. Sarah radiated joy. Her whole being smiled, her face, her healed body, her fulfilled heart. But nearby, standing quietly, was Hagar. She didn't join the music or the chatter. Her eyes stayed fixed on just one thing. Ishmael, now 16, stood among adults. No longer a little boy, yet unsure where he belonged. He observed the party closely. At times he chuckled softly with the others. At other moments he walked off alone, thoughtful and quiet. What he felt inside, no one else could say. Only Hagar truly understood her son. That day, something heavy lingered in the air. While music played and voices rose, someone noticed Ishmael laughing, maybe mocking Isaac, maybe copying a movement, or just trying to be noticed like teens often do. But Sarah caught it. To her, it wasn't harmless. It felt like a challenge, a wound reopened, a match to the flame of every fear still hidden inside her. She went to Abraham, her eyes fierce, her voice unwavering. "Send away this servant and her son. He will not inherit along with my son, Isaac." Genesis 21:10. Abraham stood still, her words pierced deeper than any blade. Send away Ishmael? His eldest son, the boy he had cradled, guided, hunted with, prayed beside. He felt his world shift. He tried to speak, but no words came. Sarah stood firm. Her sorrow had hardened into resolve. She refused to share her son's future with any rival. Isaac would be the only heir, the only light, the only promise. That night, Abraham could not sleep. He paced endlessly, prayed in silence, looked to the same stars that had once marked the start of God's promise. Then, in the hush of night, God's voice returned. "Don't be troubled about the boy or the servant. Do as Sarah has asked. Your true lineage will come through Isaac. But I will also make the servant's son into a great nation, for he is still your child." Genesis 21:12-13. Abraham dropped to the ground as if the sky had spoken his grief aloud. At dawn, before the sun broke fully over the land, he approached Hagar's tent. He brought a skin of water, some bread, and eyes that couldn't find the words for goodbye. Hagar said nothing. No questions, no weeping. She understood. Abraham handed her the skin with shaking fingers, touched Ishmael's arm, forced a half smile, but couldn't hold it. Ishmael was puzzled. He didn't grasp what was happening. He searched his father's face, but found only sorrow. No words of parting were exchanged, just the soft thud of the water bag tied shut, the cloth pulled over Hagar's head, and the sound of footsteps heading away. It wasn't a journey, it was exile. Hagar walked on, her son beside her. The wilderness stretched out endlessly. Each step carried doubt. Each breeze echoed with silence. Ishmael kept glancing back, hoping his father would call them home, but the tents soon became distant shapes against the sky. They were alone. The heat intensified. The sand scorched their feet. The water ran low. The bread turned to stone. And the silence. It thickened between mother and son. Neither dared speak aloud what both already knew. They had been left behind, to perish. Still, something inside Ishmael held on. Something he couldn't yet name. A flicker passed down from his father. A belief not yet formed, but glowing in his chest like an echo of a forgotten vow. And Hagar, she kept her eyes fixed on the dust, moving step by step, breath by breath. The child beside her wasn't just her son. He was everything, her only link to the God who once noticed her. The very home that once embraced him had now cast him into the wilderness. The desert heat wasn't just weather. It was punishment, cold in its cruelty, yet hot in its bite. The wind carried needles of sand that pricked like tiny, unseen blades. The sky above seemed made of metal, silent, closed. The earth beneath, dry and endless. Hagar's feet burned as her sandals tore on Beersheba's harsh ground. Ishmael followed, but no longer with the confident steps of the boy who once chased sheep through camp. The sun scorched their backs, and their bodies began to tremble, not from chill, but from hunger and exhaustion. The quiet between them said more than words ever could. She knew the one place she wouldn't return to. The tent where rejection waited. But where could they go now? Where was the water once promised, the peace once foretold, the comfort once whispered from heaven? The very land that had once given her life now spoke only of death. The skin flask hung dry at her side. She had pressed it, knocked it, hoping to hear even a drop. She squeezed and turned it over, shook it with trembling hands, but nothing remained. No drink, no rescue. Ishmael staggered, choking on the dry air. Hagar caught him before he collapsed. He slumped against a rock, breathing faintly. His lips split, his tongue stuck to his mouth. His gaze was distant, dulled. Still he didn't speak. He didn't weep. He didn't plead. He simply endured. And that silence, that quiet strength, broke Hagar more than any cry would. She held him close. She tried to smile, tried to say they'd manage, that sunset was near, that nighttime would bring cooler winds. But even as the words formed, she knew they were lies. Her body shook, her legs gave out. Then she made a heartbreaking choice. She walked away. She knew what was near. She laid her son beneath a brittle, dry shrub, the only bit of shade she could find, barely enough to cover his head. But it was all she had. Ishmael didn't speak. He simply laid down, his eyes shut, his skin damp with sweat, his arms limp at his sides, his chest rising and falling slower with each breath. Hagar walked. Just a few steps, not far, but enough so she couldn't see him, enough so he wouldn't see the end. She sat down at a distance, covering her face with her arms, and she wept. She cried with all her soul, from the depths of her being, every part of her breaking. She cried like a mother losing her child and powerless to stop it. She wept without forming sentences, without needing to. A raw, ancient grief, barren as the land around her. Let me not watch the boy die. Genesis 21:16. That was all she could say. Ishmael lay still. His breathing continued, barely. No tears, no words. But he felt it. He felt the agony of thirst, the ache of being left behind, the sting of being unwanted. And then something inside him gave way. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't loud or wild. It was a quiet sobbing, a faint sound, almost unnoticeable. But it rose, not to Hagar's ears, not to human ears, but to heaven. It was the voice of a cast-off child that reached God. There, in the stillness of the wilderness, with no food, no drink, no visible hope, God heard Ishmael's voice. And it wasn't the first time. The same God who had once spoken to Hagar, the same voice that said this boy would become a great people, the same presence that saw her when others looked away, saw again, and listened. Because God never forgets those who feel forgotten. He doesn't stay silent in the face of silent suffering. He doesn't turn away from the ones the world casts aside. At that moment, between Hagar's sobs and Ishmael's fading strength, heaven opened, softly, no fire, no lightning, but with presence, unseen but undeniable, as real as the burning sand. Hagar still had her head down. She hadn't yet noticed, but the atmosphere shifted. God had arrived. There were no cries anymore, just a soft weeping that reached him. The desert went still, a silence thick and sharp. No birds flew, no insects stirred, only the wind's whisper and the faint breath of pain. Hagar sat apart, her face buried in her palms. Her body slumped, her heart in pieces. Her soul no longer cried out, it only pulsed with a quiet, relentless ache. In front of her lay the child she had carried, now stretched out on the burning sand, suspended between life and death. Around them, only dust and searing heat, but even there, God was near. And just as hope vanished, the heavens broke the silence. Hagar, the voice came, clear, steady, yet tender. Slowly, she lifted her head. The air itself felt changed, as if it carried a different wind. It wasn't from the earth, nor from the sides. It came from above. What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the boy's voice where he lies. Genesis 21:17. She stilled. That voice. She remembered it. It was the same one from years earlier, when she had wandered the desert, pregnant and alone. The voice that promised Ishmael would survive, would thrive, would become a people. The voice that saw her when no one else did. And now it came again, but not for her. This time, it came for him, for Ishmael. Lift him up, hold his hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Genesis 21:18. Hagar stood slowly, her legs weak, her eyes still wet, but something had shifted. The voice carried the weight of destiny, of truth, of something divine. She looked at Ishmael. He was breathing still. His chest moved faintly. His skin was dirty, his lips cracked, but he lived. Then Hagar's vision cleared. The eyes of a mother, a servant, a woman worn down by suffering were opened. And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well. Genesis 21:19. She blinked once, then again. There it was. A well, not a vision, not a trick of the heat. Real, just as real as the thirst, the fear, and the promise made long ago. The well had always been there, but pain had blinded her, and it was God who gave her sight. Hagar ran with every last ounce of strength. She rushed to the water. Kneeling down, she filled the skin quickly, her hands shaking, but full of faith. Then she hurried to her son. She lifted his head carefully, poured water over his lips, then into his mouth, then across his face, and his breath deepened. Life returned. Ishmael's eyes opened, faint but aware. He looked at his mother, then skyward, and in that instant, beneath the same sun that once scorched them, the promise came alive again. Hagar wept, but these were different tears, no longer cries of sorrow, but of relief, of thankfulness, of wonder. She looked at the well and remembered, "You are the God who sees me." But now she could also say, "You are the God who hears." And there, in that quiet, empty wilderness, with only heaven as her witness, God confirmed once more. Ishmael would survive and become a great people. He would not live as a servant, nor fade into the background, nor be erased from memory. He would lead. He would establish a legacy. He would be named among the great. The child thrown into the dust stood again, not lifted by human hands, but by divine strength. The desert remained as it was, the sun still scorched, the trials remained. But now there was a well, a source of hope, a lasting sign that not every dry season ends in ruin. Ishmael stood up, water dripping down his chin, his gaze alive again, his body still weary, but his steps looking for strength. Hagar, beside him, smiled through tears. That well would remain, a silent reminder of God's mercy, a place where heaven quietly met earth, not with lightning, but with kindness. And Hagar would never forget. From the edge of death, a promise rose, unseen by all but God. The desert does not offer forgiveness, but it does remember. Its sand, imprinted by the footsteps of Hagar and Ishmael, held stories no wind could erase. After seeing the well that gave them life, Hagar made a decision. No longer would she live on what others discarded. She built a new home far away, in a place where no one ruled her path or told her who she had to be. And there, in the dry and rocky land, Ishmael grew up, not under Abraham's shelter, not with the ease of inheritance, but with freedom, free from expectations, free from masks. The wind became his mentor, the open land his lessons, the fight for food and water his daily test. His body toughened quickly, his strength grew, his feet adapted to stone and heat, and his eyes sharpened like a hunter's. He learned to move soundlessly, to read the trails in the sand, to tell new prints from old ones. He could detect the breath of a gazelle from far off. His first bow was a crooked stick and a rope woven by hand. His hands bled, but he kept going. Each day he returned to practice, and when at last the arrow flew straight and struck a rock, he smiled, and it felt as if the desert smiled too. Ishmael became a marksman, not for play, but because life demanded it. Hagar watched him quietly, full of pride. She never stepped in. She understood that the land would shape him, that thirst would be his discipline. This wasn't the time to shield him. It was the time for him to be shaped. The nights were bitter cold. Often they curled up beside each other in silence, listening to the rustle of sand and the distant cries of wild beasts. Ishmael never spoke of Abraham, But at night, when he stared at the stars, his gaze would linger, as if waiting for a reply that never arrived. The one thing he clung to was the promise that had once been spoken. God had said, "I will make him into a great nation." Yet all he saw around him was dust, rocks, and stillness. No tribe, no followers, no banner flying, just him, his mother, and a thirsty land. But that land received him, and he welcomed it too. He learned to see water where others saw only ruin. He uncovered hidden springs, stones that cast precious shade, roots that stored hidden moisture. He became part of the land, part of the sun, part of the creatures that made the desert their home. In time, his reputation spread. Ishmael, the southern warrior, the hunter whose eyes didn't need to be open, the archer whose arrows always struck true. Travelers who encountered him spoke his name with reverence, some in fear, others in admiration. But even with his rising stature, he remained alone. Hagar sensed it, and deep in her heart, she knew her son needed more than survival. He needed a home, even one built of canvas. He needed a family name, a presence beside him, someone to share warmth, long nights, quiet laughter, and stories whispered under the stars. So she traveled back to Egypt, the land she came from, and there she found a wife for him. Her name was never written, but her roots were Egyptian, like Hagar's. She would understand the desert, its rhythms, its silence, and the weight of words unspoken. Their union was modest. No great celebration like those in Canaan, no nobility in attendance, but there was fire, there was bread, there were two pairs of eyes meeting, and a bond was formed. And with that, the boy stepped into manhood. He now had his own shelter. His steps grew firmer, his voice deeper, his presence more commanding. But within, something still stirred. He had strength, skill, a wife, and respect, but a part of him still searched. The desert had molded him, but it hadn't quieted his spirit. Though his body was shaped for this land, his soul longed for something solid. He couldn't name it, a space within him, a distant pull, a quiet ache for the father who once held him but let him go, for a home that gave him comfort but then cast him out, for a promise heard but not yet fulfilled. The wilderness gave him roots, but not peace. His wife gave him children, but not peace. His bow gave him food, but not legacy. The desert became his home, but his heart still searched for rest. Time in the wilderness isn't counted by minutes or bells. It's marked by the rising and setting of the sun, and by how thin your sandals become. Every line on the face holds a memory. Every missing tooth holds a lesson. Every scar tells a tale the desert carved without asking for consent. Ishmael was now a man. The child saved at the well had become a leader, a provider, a father. The years had shaped his face with grit, filled his eyes with knowledge of distant lands, and hardened his hands to build, shield, and lead. Hagar, now aged, watched him with quiet satisfaction. She rarely spoke. There was no need. The way she shaped the bread, secured the tent, or watched over the water skin said everything about the path they had walked. Ishmael's lone tent had become one of many. Around him, families began to gather. It wasn't sudden. It happened over time. The sons born to his Egyptian wife started to grow. Men like him, born under an unforgiving sky, raised by wind's howl, and forged in battles for every sip of water. In time, each of Ishmael's sons pitched his own tent. There were 12 of them, named in Genesis 25:13 through 16. Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedemah. All bore the blood of wanderers. They didn't inherit estates, but they carried the spirit of a father who mastered lands others feared. They received no fortresses, but they inherited the wind, unyielding and wild. They built no cities, but they claimed ground. They wore no crowns, but they raised tents with pride, and those tents multiplied. Spread by the wind, travelers passing through their territory found honor and care. Drifting tribes were met with fairness, and aggressors faced fierce defense. These desert clans had no kings, yet they followed one man, the one who endured where others had fallen. His 12 sons became chiefs. Their groups expanded. What began as a single family grew into a recognized people, a desert nation, a people who bent to no one, who knew the weight of silence and sand, a people with no walls, but unshakable identity. Ishmael wore no royal robes, but he was listened to. He held no staff, but his voice held weight. He was honored as a father to many, and those who once ridiculed his beginning now lowered their gaze in his presence, because they saw he was unlike anyone else. He was not shaped by comfort, but by pain, not made strong by honor, but by being cast aside. He never knew the safety of being sheltered, only the strength of sheltering others. He became a leader, but more than that, a living witness, a reminder that God listens, a sign that the cast out are still seen, a testament that even in a barren wilderness, a people can rise from the sound of a single cry. And though others honored him, though he fathered many, though his tents stretched across dry lands, Ishmael still carried something within, a silence that years couldn't soothe, a hollow space that time refused to fill. He still saw the image of his father, Abraham, the hand that once guided him, the eyes that couldn't bear farewell, the day his tent faded behind him, and the moment he walked into emptiness with only bread and water. Ishmael knew he was not chosen to inherit Canaan's fields, but now he also knew with certainty that God had chosen him for something greater. While others clung to estates, he rooted himself in dust. While others fought to fence land, he raised homes wherever the wind allowed. While kings perished and their thrones crumbled, Ishmael watched his children rise, his camps expand, his stories echo through the sands. He taught his sons how to locate secret wells, how to move in stillness, how to protect without striking first. But more than all, he taught them how to endure, for endurance was his legacy. There were no carved altars or sacred writings tied to his name, but there was something stronger, a heritage, a presence, a story told by the very sand beneath their feet. Those who slept beneath his tents felt it. He wasn't just a tribal head, he was more than a father of many. He was the founder of a promise that hadn't yet unfolded in full, and every time the desert wind passed through the camp, it was as if the heavens whispered, "I haven't forgotten." He lacked land deeds, but he was building a people. The desert remembers. Its dunes may cover old tracks, but they don't forget. They may hide bones, but they hold on to history. And there, where the sky meets the scorched soil in an endless horizon, Ishmael and his sons learned that liberty is never without cost. At first, there was only space, room to pitch tents, tend animals, and dig where water refused to show. But in time, space became more valuable than gold, and others began to notice. The disputes didn't start with battle cries. They arrived in whispers, a stolen well, a nighttime raid on sheep, a messenger who vanished, a murmur among tribes over land claims. So began the silent wars. Ishmael knew his people had no fortresses. His sons didn't carry gleaming weapons or march like soldiers, but they held what no ruler could command, the strength to endure. His warriors knew the desert better than any outsider. They understood the rhythm of the rocks, how to disappear into dunes, how to read the wind's change and hear when the sand betrayed footsteps. The opposition, tribes of Kedar, Nebaioth, Jeta, descendants of Ishmael himself, began to stand not just as families, but as guardians of their heritage. They didn't aim to conquer cities, they simply wanted to live in the land heaven had led them to. But peace comes at a price. Before long, surrounding powers realized that this wandering people was far tougher to defeat than expected. The Babylonians came. The Assyrians came. Soldiers hired to guard caravans and secure desert trade routes arrived with scrolls, warriors, and blueprints for control. But whenever they pushed too far, they disappeared. Not because Ishmael's line was ruthless, but because the desert protects its own. The first clashes were swift and sharp, sudden strikes, arrows flying with deadly aim, fires lit at just the right moment. By the time enemies arrived, the tents were gone, every trace wiped clean, silence reclaimed. Yet the land bore scars. Ishmael's sons learned early, freedom requires constant awareness. To keep what's yours, you must understand its worth. The desert can shelter, but it can also demand a price. One night, a rival tribe tried to seize Massa's wells. They came armed with iron blades and gleaming shields, but they didn't find easy prey. They met hidden bowmen, tumbling stones from hilltops, and darts thrown with precision. By dawn, their fallen lay around the water's edge. Ishmael, older but unbroken, walked among them wordlessly. His eyes were sharp. This wasn't triumph, it was survival. He knelt beside the spring, touched the water, looked to his gathered sons and said, "Never surrender what God has placed in your hands." They answered him not with words, but with steady eyes. They understood. The desert was theirs, not taken by force, but earned through endurance. They weren't born to rule empires, but neither would they kneel. Their backs were strong, their palms tough, their ties held by blood and memory. Over time, the names of Ishmael and his descendants echoed across distant lands. Some labeled them wild, others called them primitive, but none dismissed them. Because behind each tribe stood legacy, pain reshaped into power, banishment turned into belonging, a boy once crying beneath a bush, now a forefather whose people defended sacred land with dust, strength, and resolve. Ishmael wrote no decrees, but lived by a truth: never forget your beginning. He didn't walk among crowds, yet entire lineages followed his path. He wore no crown, yet men lowered their heads in his presence, because they knew this was the man once pushed away from the promise, yet never left by God. And the blood flowing through him would nourish a people. The wind across the dunes carried more than sand. It carried destiny. Among the dunes and stillness, in the lifeless center of a land where only endurance grew, a sacred promise began to unfold before all. What was once an angel's whisper near a spring now took on flesh, identity, and lineage. Ishmael had become a father, not of one or two, but of 12 sons. 12 children who would do more than extend his bloodline. They would become the roots of entire nations. These tribes expanded, settled, and claimed the desert between Egypt and Assyria. They weren't ordinary heirs, they were royalty, just as Scripture says. Genesis 25:16. Every name carried a calling, each name stood for something. Each name was the legacy of a boy who once cried under thorny branches while death crept near. Now those sons walked the sands as leaders. The eldest, Nebaioth, noble and just, ruled with clarity and fairness. His people became known for their honesty and vast herds. Then came Kedar, a natural fighter, an archer like his father, commander of a tribe so skilled even enemies gave them honor. Adbeel, the third, was quiet and devout, chosen to safeguard their history and memory. Mibsam and Mishma, a bonded pair, were famed for navigating trade routes that others feared, mapping paths through hostile terrain. Duma and Massa built pacts with neighboring clans, stretching their tents into places once believed uninhabitable. Their names became known among travelers and wanderers, symbols of resilience and reliability. Hadad, eighth in line, was fiery but devoted. He made quick decisions and led his people to bold success. Tema, though younger, held deep wisdom and formed councils among his tribesmen, guiding even those older than him. And then there were Jetur, Naphish, and Kedema, three brothers who reached the farthest corners of the region, setting the limits of what would one day be called the Ishmaelite domain. At every border of the desert, an Ishmaelite stood. In every dry valley, a fire was lit by one of his sons. In every tale told beneath the stars, Ishmael's name returned. The promise was no longer a hope. It was real, unshakable, and enduring. Hagar, aged now, looked on from a quiet distance, her eyes wet with emotion. She had witnessed her child cast out, their water emptied, and faith extinguished, only to see it reborn. Now she saw little ones racing between tents, her sons honored, the birth of a nation grown through hardship, trust, and grit. And Ishmael, always steady, the man who once stood alone, now taught others to walk together. Sitting by his tent's entrance, he welcomed his sons back from their journeys, bringing stories of success, trade, and friendships. There were no thrones, but there was peace. There were no golden crowns, but there was honor. He never lost sight of his beginnings. He still remembered Abraham's hand offering him the water skin, and at times Sarah's piercing gaze returned to him in dreams. But the past didn't break him, it formed him. Now he saw it clearly. The promise wasn't cancelled, just redirected. This was never Isaac against Ishmael. They were separate stories, distinct destinies, both guided by God's hand. One gave rise to kings and prophets, the other to desert leaders, free men who turned each journey into defiance and each son into a walking promise. The 12 tribes of Ishmael lived without stone walls, yet understood the boundaries of respect. Their names endured across ages. Centuries on, rulers would speak of Kedar, prophets would pen his name, ancient texts would describe their caravans. The Ishmaelites would live on, in chronicles, in legend, in shared memory. And it all began with a boy on the edge of death and a mother who couldn't bear to watch. Now, around the well that saved them, tents stood as testaments. Sons gathered, children played, meals were cooked, and elders passed down stories. It was a nation, a real nation, with no throne, no fortress, but filled with purpose, spirit, and identity. Ishmael walked among them as one surveying land not inherited, but earned through belief and persistence. His hands were worn by time, his gaze deepened by life, and his voice still held weight. And when he spoke, his sons listened. He called the 12 together, as he did every season, to recount the past, the moment God heard his voice, the day his mother's eyes were opened to water, the promise thought lost, now fulfilled beside him. 12 sons, 12 leaders, and a heritage written across time's endless sands. The desert knows no hours. Time there is counted by memory and the patience of waiting. Age is shown in the eyes, burden in the shoulders, wisdom in the space between words. Ishmael had become a true patriarch. His hair, once black like the desert shadows, now shimmered with silver beneath the sun. His skin bore the signatures of time, but his frame stood strong. His hands still held the bow with mastery, and among the tribes his name resonated with strength. No one dismissed him. Even his enemies showed him respect. He was more than a tracker, more than a chief. He was a survivor turned legend, a man born beyond the covenant, who turned exile into legacy. Ishmael's story crossed deserts and valleys, etched forever in the breath of the wind. His name was spoken along trade routes, honored by merchants and invoked by tribal chiefs. Whenever it came up, the mood shifted. They said he was never caught off guard, that he could hear a serpent sliding across sand from afar, that his bow acted as part of his own body, and that his arrows cut through the air like threads of wind. These were not myths, but real memories. Once, a band of raiders from the north attempted to seize a well belonging to his descendants. They came cloaked in night, armed with blades and schemes, hoping to surprise. But they hadn't counted on Ishmael standing guard. With his bow across his back, eyes sharp, and feet grounded in the sand, he stood between the attackers and the water. He said nothing. The first arrow, hissing through the dark, said all that was needed. It struck the ground near the enemy chief. Clear warning, unmistakable. The invaders withdrew without a single clash, without a word, because they knew this man had already faced trials far beyond their understanding. And it wasn't only foes who recognized his power. His sons gathered around his fire, listening with awe, as if receiving wisdom from a prophet. But Ishmael never claimed greatness. He spoke modestly, remembering not only triumphs, but also his mother's sobs, the hidden well, and the quiet space between him and his father. He said that silence taught him to hear the desert. For the desert does not use speech. It communicates in shifts of air, in burning light, in hollow space. From it, he learned to move unseen, to hunt without waste, to guard without force, to lead without taking. Most of all, he learned to live without clinging to what had never been offered. He had never known a throne, and none was needed among his people. Leadership came through action, through the shared memory that they rose from nothing, yet now lacked nothing. They had freedom, purpose, and a name no longer tied to sorrow, but to respect. During tribal gatherings, when elders met to plan paths, share resources, or forge alliances, Ishmael always spoke last. Not because he lacked voice, but because his word brought closure. He never needed to shout, yet when he spoke, silence fell. His advice was short, but carried the wisdom of many lifetimes, as if even the sand paused to hear it. And his bow was never far. He kept it polished and strung, always ready. It was more than a tool. It was his story, his inheritance, the object that followed him through every phase of life, now resting beside the memories he held most dear. On ceremonial evenings, Ishmael would take his bow and loose a single arrow into the twilight, always aimed where the wind blew. The act was quiet, but rich with meaning. His sons stood in silence, his grandsons watched wide-eyed, and visiting elders nodded with solemn respect. That arrow wasn't just wood in motion, it was a memory, a symbol of the time he was cast into the wilderness with nothing, of the moment his mother believed he wouldn't survive, of how the world wrote him off, and how in that very hour God heard him. The string's twang was the sound of defiance, of trust, of rebirth, a sound that echoed the survival of a boy who grew into a man stronger than sorrow. Each shot carried the weight of exile. That day the sky turned grey, not from rain, for rain rarely visits the desert, but from morning. The air felt different, slower, burdened, as if even the wind sensed a great one had passed. Abraham, God's friend, bearer of the covenant, wanderer of faith, was gone. He had taken his last breath in peace after a long, full life. Genesis 25:8. But even giants of belief returned to dust like all others. Now the father's body lay in linen, prepared for burial, and after years of separation, Ishmael returned. No word had been sent to summon him, no rider dispatched to his distant camp, but he knew. Blood always knows. The soul feels, and a shared spirit recognizes when something shifts. He arrived before Isaac could ask how to receive him. He stepped down from his mount, walked with steady pace, bow on his back, bearing the lines of time and the quiet shadow of the boy he had once been. Isaac, the promised son, stood silently. Their eyes met. No greeting passed between them. Isaac held the shroud over their father. Ishmael stood at the entrance and lowered his head. That gesture erased the years. In that quiet second, the entire past stood between them. The cry in the desert, the empty skin of water, Abraham's silence, God's presence, all there, lying in between two brothers and their father. Together, they carried him to the cave at Machpelah, the place Abraham himself had chosen, where Sarah had been laid to rest. It was a place made sacred by silver, by sacrifice, and by the unwavering faith of a man who had left all behind for a promise not yet seen. They bore the body together. No servant stepped forward. No one else touched it. Only two sons, one from the promise, the other from the wilderness, on either side of the man who had brought them both into the world, and in doing so had driven them apart. And in that quiet burial, there were no loud chants, no dramatic displays. But the silence spoke volumes, more than any weeping could, deeper than any eulogy. It told of all that could have been but wasn't, all that time took and never returned. Ishmael stared at the stone sealing the grave as if gazing into a mirror. Beneath it rested the father he had known and would not see again, the man who gave him life and also exile, the man who loved him and sent him away. Yet there was no bitterness in Ishmael. Pain, yes, longing, deeply, but no resentment, for age had shown him that some wounds are not healed through anger, but through understanding. And standing before that tomb, he understood. Abraham had acted in obedience, believing it was God's path, and he, Ishmael, had not perished, but thrived, had grown strong, and fathered a nation. Now he had returned, not in anger, but to bury the man who had shaped his beginning. On the other side, Isaac was equally unsettled. The man before him was both familiar and foreign, his brother, yet a stranger. The boy who had been sent away was now a seasoned leader, the head of many. And in that moment, they stood not as opponents, not as the chosen and the rejected, but as sons mourning their father. The silence lingered. No hugs, no harsh words, just mutual regard. A space remained between them, not made of conflict, but of years unshared and roads never crossed. When the last handful of earth was dropped, Ishmael was the first to leave. He mounted his horse, took one final glance at the cave's opening, and rode off, not fleeing, simply continuing his journey. Isaac stayed behind. He would carry on the legacy of the promise, dwelling among herds, altars, and a line built on faith. But he would never see his brother again. And Ishmael, too, would not return. The wilderness called him. Solitude was his sanctuary, liberty his truth. And although their paths split, their stories remained intertwined. Because what binds brothers cannot be undone by years, by parting or by the grave. God remembers. That day, two brothers laid their father into the ground, yet the space between them lingered. The desert does more than cover. It conceals, but also preserves. Like wind-blown parchment, it guards the memory of those who once walked with courage and dignity. Ishmael's name was no longer just his own. It had become a symbol, an ancestral voice echoing through the generations across the Arabian deserts, from Egypt's edge to the banks of the Euphrates, from highlands to coastlines, a name whispered by the wind through marketplaces and nomad tents alike. His descendants controlled the trade roads, not by force, but with wisdom, adaptability, foresight, and grit. They knew each spring by heart, every rock shade, and the pattern of stars that guided the caravans. For them, the desert wasn't a barrier, it was a living map. The Ishmaelites governed the routes that moved gold, incense, salt, perfume, spices, and myrrh. Traders from Phoenicia, Babylon, and Egypt had to negotiate with them, cross their lands, and honor their terms. Anyone hoping to reach distant worlds had to pass where Ishmael's sons guarded the sands. The tents of Kedar, for instance, became legendary. Woven from dark, sturdy fabric by the tribe's women, they stood resilient against storms and time. Visible from miles away, they signaled welcome or warning. Centuries later, prophets of Israel would still mention them. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel all spoke of Ishmael's descendants as an undeniable presence in the desert's balance of power. It wasn't conquest, it was influence. Not enforced rule, but authority through rootedness. Ishmael's descendants formed structured clans, each with its own traditions, leaders, and treaties. Yet they shared a bond, a name passed down from one not chosen by rulers, but called by God. Among them, liberty was prized above all wealth. No throne could lure them. No capital held their interest. The dunes were their citadel, the stars their roof. The glow of fire at dusk, their sacred space. Even the greatest kingdoms recognized them as a distinct nation. While Isaac's lineage built altars and gathered in villages across Canaan, Ishmael's sons moved outward in spirals, like the wind touching every edge of the land. Their possessions were few, their spirits vast, their eyes watchful. They passed their history by voice. Stories of their forefather were told under the stars, of the divine voice in the desert, the spring that appeared when all hope vanished, the bough that never missed its mark, and the child whose tears reached the heavens. Generations changed, but the names endured. Nebaioth became known as the progenitor of the Nabateans, stone city builders and rulers of Arabian commerce. Kedar was famed as the home of valiant men and dignified women. Duma, Massa, Tamar, each became a house, a name, a heritage. A living past, spoken to sons and passed on to theirs. They never forgot their story. They knew their roots. And though they had been sent away from Abraham's dwelling and received no share in Canaan, they inherited what no hand could take, the favor of God, promised and fulfilled. Ishmael no longer walked among them. Time had granted him a peaceful old age, but what he no longer saw, his descendants carried forward. In every oasis, a clan; in every market, a legacy. In every caravan moved a remnant of the spirit of one who once stood face to face with death and was lifted by the hand of the Almighty. Even those unfamiliar with his full story honored his name when they heard it. It was as if the desert itself whispered, "Here walked one whom the world forgot, but heaven did not. Here lived a man who began with little, yet sowed abundantly. Here rose a people with no throne, yet guided by lasting purpose." Wherever they traveled, Ishmael's descendants left behind trails of structure, insight, and quiet might. They didn't draft statutes, but their lives inspired unwritten laws. They didn't raise sanctuaries, but they studied the sky for signs. They didn't pursue empires, but their movement gave them authority. Their tribes multiplied, joining with neighboring peoples. Yet across generations, the memory of their father endured. For everything they became had begun with a child beneath a bush, a tearful cry that reached the heavens and was never forgotten. Men may fall, but their voices echo. When desert winds sweep through still tents, they carry whispers of old, echoes buried in dust, fragments of legacy drifting through sand. Among those whispers, one refused to vanish: the voice of Ishmael. Though his feet no longer touched the earth, though his hands no longer pulled a bowstring, though his eyes no longer searched the horizon, his legacy breathed through his growing lineage, spreading through the east, the sons of his name. His sons bore sons. From the 12 princes came tribes. and from those tribes, regions and realms emerged. They extended through the sands of Paran, into the Arabian valleys, and out to Mesopotamian borders. Not remnants of history, but foundations of what would follow. What was born in exile had become a people acknowledged by both divine and earthly records. The prophets of Israel, God's messengers, began to speak his name. Isaiah, the seer, wrote of Kedar, Ishmael's son, and his enduring tents, his large flocks, and his warriors. Isaiah 21:16-17. Jeremiah named the desert tribes, Duma and the other descendants of the cast-out son. Jeremiah 49:28. Ezekiel, writing in a foreign land, also described the Arab traders, the merchants who journeyed from Ishmael's line and brought goods to Tyre. Ezekiel 27:20-21. The Bible, which had once only whispered of his birth, now declared his legacy boldly. Not as outsiders, not as forgotten, but as a rightful voice in the sacred narrative. Kedar, born of Hagar's line, became a symbol of Arab life, a people of strength, skilled with weapons, wise in trade. Their tents were recorded, not for weakness, but for their endurance. The tents of Kedar came to represent endurance and might. Even the psalm writers knew the name. Ishmael was no longer just the child wandering the wasteland. He had become a symbol, a legacy woven into the path of divine revelation. In Psalm 120, the poet cries, "Woe to me, for I dwell in Meshech, and I live among the tents of Kedar." Even those who viewed the Ishmaelites as outsiders acknowledged their weight in history, for they were present everywhere. Their herds sustained rulers, their caravans brought treasures, and their territories bordered vast kingdoms. And even those who had never heard Hagar's story in full knew the name of her son. Time could not erase it. His distance from Abraham's tent did not remove him from God's remembrance. The promise still stood. "I will also make a nation from the son of the servant, because he is your offspring." Genesis 21:13. And now the world began to hear the echo of that promise. In the sacred songs of Psalms and in the visions of prophets, the boy's voice from the desert returned, not as grief, but as legacy, not as noise, but as divine reply. His children did more than trade, they shaped values. They created customs, legal codes, and social systems. And even without royal titles, their reach touched palaces. Ancient maps could not be drawn without crossing their lineage. The prophecy lived on. The boy who once cried beneath desert thorns now spoke through the scrolls, the tribal songs, the recorded names of sacred history. Had Hagar seen it, she would have smiled. The scorned servant, the woman who fled sorrow, the mother who whispered, "I cannot watch him die," as she laid her son in the dust. Now she would see he had not died. He lived, he grew strong, he led nations, and his voice was heard. Scripture remembered him, history remembered him, and God never forgot. The desert was hushed. There was no stirring wind, no raiders, no caravan bells, only a slow, steady breeze moving like a prayer across ancient stones. This was not an ending, only the close of a chapter. Ishmael walked alone that morning, his steps no longer firm, his hands no longer strong, but his eyes held everything: remembrance, conviction, sorrow, and the truth of fulfillment. Every step was a memory. The day he was cast into exile, the tears of his mother, the silence of his father, the moment he thought it was over. And then God's voice broke through the sky. God has heard the boy. Genesis 21:17. He never forgot those words. They weren't just scripture. They were the story of his life, summed up in a single sentence. As his journey drew to its final chapter, he looked back, not with resentment, but with clarity. Though men had cast him aside, God had lifted him up. Though pushed out from tents, he was given land from heaven. Though kept from the covenant, he became its fulfillment for many. Ishmael finally grasped the mystery that had always surrounded him, even before his birth. It wasn't by chance that his name meant God hears, for his life proved that God listens, even to those the world forgets. In 1 Samuel 2:30 it is written, "Those who honor me I will honor. Those who despise me I will treat with contempt." Ishmael had no worldly inheritance, but he possessed unwavering faith. He built no altars, yet he walked in obedience. No loud blessings were shouted over him, but quiet answers came, answers that changed futures. While others craved glory and legacy, Ishmael walked along the edges, and on those very edges, God birthed new beginnings. God never abandoned him, not once. When Abraham spoke no words, God still did. When Sarah drove him away, God opened the earth to reveal a well. When no shelter stood, no water flowed, and no tree offered shade, God's eyes remained upon him. His bow no longer sliced the sky. His arrows rested quietly now. His feet searched for a final place of peace, but his spirit remained certain. He had lived just as the promise declared. I will make him into a great nation, Genesis 21:18. And this was never just about bloodlines. Ishmael became a symbol, a witness that the forgotten can be chosen, that God doesn't judge by status, but by what lies within a man's soul. He knew he wasn't just a side note in someone else's story. He was a living testimony. His name would echo through time. His people would carve trails. His sons would be counted, his clans respected. His legacy would drift with the desert winds down to the final grain of sand. Sitting at the threshold of his tent in the plains of Havilah, Ishmael looked up one last time. The sun dipped low, but within him something new began to rise. Eternity. Not carved from stone or royalty, but from a life sealed by divine remembrance. His wives, children, grandchildren, and servants gathered, and in that sacred moment he gave no long farewell. He simply said, I am the one whom God heard. And they knew, for his journey was written in their rough hands, in the soles of worn sandals, and in the strength of their tribes. God listened, God watched, God upheld. Ishmael lay down with his kin. He was gathered to his people, and in the quiet of the desert, which embraced him one last time, there was no mourning, only reverence. The voice of the child, once forgotten by the world, now reached the ears of heaven. God heard, God saw, God fulfilled, and the one once cast aside became everlasting. Time may move on, but God's promises endure. The shifting sands, marked by long-lost footprints, keep moving with the wind. Tribes are born, empires collapse, nations rise anew. Yet of all the stories the desert has ever cradled, one remains, the story of Ishmael. He was the boy not expected to survive, the one left behind, cut off from human promises, dismissed by those he once called family. But he was also the one God chose to hear. Ishmael never built a temple, but his name became the bedrock of a people. He never ruled from Jerusalem, but his descendants pitched tents that stretched beyond horizons. He did not sit beside kings, but his blood flows through the hands of warriors, visionaries, and poets. His legacy of spirit reached beyond centuries. One cannot tell the history of the Middle East or humanity without speaking his name. Ishmael's children became strong tribes: Kedarites, Nabateans, Temanites. Their legacy is still read today in ruins and manuscripts. In Islamic tradition, Ishmael is revered as both prophet and patriarch, an ancestor of Muhammad, Islam's final prophet. To many Muslims, his bloodline reflects deep loyalty to God, and his life stands as a beacon of submission and endurance. The story of his willingness to be sacrificed beside his father Abraham is remembered yearly during Eid al-Adha, a celebration of surrender and trust in divine wisdom. In the Bible, Ishmael remains, not as a side note, but as a witness that God remembers those others forget. The Bible, the Quran, and ancient Arab storytelling all preserve his voice. Yet his voice is not just a sound from the past. It speaks still. It calls out to the unseen, the cast out, the forgotten. It comforts mothers who cry in the shadows for children bearing injustice. It reaches wandering souls, searching dry paths for unseen water. It calls to those whose very names feel like burdens, longing to be seen. Ishmael is the eternal reminder God hears. And if God once heard a boy, lost in the sand, alone, faint, overlooked, he still listens. Even now, in an age of conflict and peace, of fracture and healing, Ishmael's story stands as a bridge between nations, between brothers, between belief and belonging. His story does not end at a grave. It breathes wherever dust gathers, wherever silence lingers, wherever hope refuses to fade. To you, the one who has felt cast aside. To you, forgotten by others. To you, with no title, no legacy passed down. Ishmael's journey is yours too, because his life shows this. Memory is not decided by human hands. It is God who writes eternity, one word at a time, in strokes of grace. And the voice that once declared, "Name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your affliction," still speaks across the sands of your soul. The world may forget, people may look away, but God hears, God sees, God responds. And Ishmael's story is not just told, it still speaks.